Ich werde hier gleich mal einen Beitrag des Kanals Australian Guard spiegeln, der, wie ich finde, ein bisschen mehr Aufmerksamkeit verdient hat und dessen Videos sich um die Themen Identität, Geschichte und Kultur drehen. Alles Bereiche, in denen locker 8 von 10 Männer im Westen drastischen Nachholbedarf haben. Hätten sie den nicht, wären wir nicht in der Situation, in der wir sind. Und die australischen Missstände, die sind ja quasi deckungsgleich mit den europäischen, den amerikanischen und in Teilen auch den südafrikanischen. In diesem speziellen Beitrag hier geht es um die sogenannte Frauenbefreiung, die ja wirklich weitreichende Folgen hatte und hat. Sieh dir das ruhig mal bis zum Ende an und wenn dich Identitätsfragen interessieren, was eigentlich Pflicht ist, ja, dann kannst du dich auch ein bisschen durch die anderen Videos dieses Kanals klicken.
What if women's liberation didn't liberate women at all? We're told it brought freedom, equality, empowerment, that feminism rescued women from oppression and gave them choices, that society became more enlightened when it left behind the traditional home. But what if that's not the whole story? Because since this so-called liberation, families are breaking down, birth rates are crashing, millions grow up without fathers or mothers, mental illness, sexual confusion, and loneliness are rising, and nobody wants to talk about why. What if women weren't liberated, but reassigned, from being the heart of the home to cogs in a corporate machine, from being honored for virtue to being degraded for likes? We'll explore how feminism redefined womanhood, hollowed out the family, and left both men and women adrift. And we'll go through and show how we can fix what's been lost. Because if we don't make a change now, the next generations will continue to pay the price. In modern culture, the women's liberation movement is often presented as a noble grassroots uprising. One where brave women broke free from oppression and marched towards freedom and equality. But the story is a lot more complex than that. Contrary to the romanticized image, the feminist movement of the late 60s had backing from powerful institutions. This was not a purely organic cultural shift. Investigations, including those published in the New York Times and Time, have detailed links between early feminist icons like Gloria Steinem and US intelligence agencies. Declassified documents reveal that Steinem received early support from organizations funded by the CIA, including the Independent Research Service, an organization that helped steer youth culture and public messaging during the Cold War era. Steinem herself has acknowledged the connection, although she insists it was strategic and harmless. Why would such institutions take an interest in women's liberation? Well, because encouraging women to join the workforce served multiple interests. Economically, a 2-income household meant more taxable income. Socially, children would be increasingly raised in public institutions rather than at home meant early shaping of values and beliefs of these children would be by the government, not by their parents. In short, moving women en masse from the home into the workforce aligned well with broader state control and their economic goals. Early feminist waves also weren't as harmless as often claimed. The suffragette movement had internal divisions. While some advocated simply for voting rights, others embraced extreme ideas that challenged the idea of family itself that had stood and led to prosperous families for 1600 years in the West prior. Figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others in the early 20th centuries were critical not only of political inequality, but of traditional family roles. Some sought to liberate women from what they saw as oppressive domestic life, rather than to elevate the role of a woman. It's important to note that a lot of the early suffragette leaders were anti-family activists, not just kind-hearted equality seekers. But by the late 60s and early 70s, these ideas had evolved into a new cultural force. Feminism shifted from asking for equal opportunity to promoting a new social model. One where domestic roles were seen as oppressive, motherhood seen as limiting, and female fulfillment was seen as tied to primarily your education, career, and personal autonomy, which, now any actual conservative or, right-wing guy who's looking for a wife to raise their kids doesn't care about those things. The foreign-owned media, universities, and advertising companies began to reinforce this feminism narrative. The homemaker was no longer celebrated, she became a symbol of oppression. The empowered woman of the future, we were told, was independent, career-driven, and unbound by tradition. But in reality, many of these ideals were shaped and amplified by institutions with interests beyond women's well-being, including those in politics, media, and finance. As we've already stated, the facts disprove the idea that the movement was purely organic or solely about the freedom of women. What was portrayed as a call for dignity and fairness was later revealed to serve a much broader agenda, one with lasting consequences for family, faith, and all Western nations. With the cultural shift of the late 60s and the 70s came profound changes in the structure of the home. At the heart of traditional Western society stood the nuclear family for a long time. Father, mother, children, each with distinct and valuable roles, each for their own. Feminism aimed to question, destabilize, and ultimately destroy this model that had proven the test of time, leading to healthy, functioning families in the West from around 300 AD up until the 1970s. And unfortunately, it succeeded in its doing so and bringing of destruction. Women were encouraged to leave the home and pursue careers, which in many cases brought a sense of financial independence. But the mass exodus from homemaking wasn't just a personal choice. It was pushed as a necessity. Media, academia, and pop culture suggested that staying home was regressive, while working outside the home was empowering. They shamed part of what it meant to be a woman, so that the new generation of women would not want to live this way. My mum is a very good example of this. She had a family, she had kids, and stayed at home, and she was made fun of by her sister, so my auntie, and her friends, where they laughed at her, calling her, "Oh, you're a breeder, that's all you are," making fun of her and making comments like that while they worked. And look who is more fulfilled now. My mom has kids and will have grandchildren and a family and legacy, whereas her sister and those friends are unfortunately miserable women in their 50s with no hope at having a family, no hope at having kids, no husband, and just a career that they worked for and really just doesn't and didn't satisfy them. And this is all a product of the women's liberation movement. One immediate consequence of this movement was, like we've been talking about, the breakdown of the family. Between 1970 and 1990, divorce rates skyrocketed in most Western nations, let alone where it is now in the 2020s. And scholars have linked this trend to several factors, such as the ridiculous no-fault divorce laws, shifting values and morals with the removal of Christianity from our culture and society, and the pressure on both partners to work, all of which women's liberation had a massive impact on. As more women joined the workforce, dual income households became the norm, but this didn't ease economic strain. It absolutely raised the cost of living. What once could be supported by one income now required two. We were told that women's liberation would bring about a more just, equal, and happy society. That by breaking free from traditional roles, women would experience greater fulfillment, freedom, and flourishing. But decades later, the raw data tells a very different story. Across the Western world, birth rates have dropped below replacement level. In countries like Italy, Germany, Japan, and now even the US, native populations are shrinking. And similar with Australia, the UK. These aren't isolated trends. They represent a generational collapse of fertility. Fewer marriages, fewer children, and an aging population that cannot sustain itself. Meanwhile, many traditional cultures, those that still value family, religion, and distinct gender roles, are thriving demographically. In parts of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, communities that stick to these strong families and roles and values, they continue to grow in population. The difference is not economic, but cultural. When motherhood is honored and family is prioritized, life multiplies. When it's dismissed, society declines. At the same time, studies have shown that women today are less happy, much less happy, than they were 50 years ago. This may come as a surprise to those who believe that career opportunities and personal autonomy should automatically translate into fulfillment. But as early as 2009, researchers Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, in a particular paper titled "The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness," found that women's overall satisfaction had been declining across multiple Western countries since the 1970s. Shock, what happened around then? And yeah, even as gender equality indicators per se improved. This is an attack on so-called progress. It's maybe it is, but it's a reality check. When women are pulled in all directions, expected to achieve, compete, nurture, and self-optimize all at once, burnout is inevitable. What feminism sold as freedom often became a recipe for anxiety. Today's hookup culture adds another layer of emotional damage. Relationships have been replaced by transactions. Dating apps commodify people, and genuine connection is harder to find, especially across Gen Z. And as marriage is delayed or discarded, more children are raised in broken homes or without fathers or mothers, or not necessarily as marriage is discarded, as divorce is through the roof, largely because of feminism and no-fault divorce laws. This also applies to lots of children having tough upbringings. In the US alone, over 40% of births are to unmarried women, a figure that is growing in all parts of Europe, Australia as well. Millions of women now rely on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication to manage the stress of a life that was supposed to be empowering. Birth control pills, hailed as a key to freedom, have been linked in multiple studies to increase risks of depression and diminished long-term partner bonding. Meanwhile, state-run childcare has become a necessity, not a choice, for some dual-income families. The most formative years of a child's life, once nurtured and raised by a mother at home, are now often handed over to rotating staff and institutional settings, with children increasingly spending their formative years in divorced and broken homes and these daycare centers, government schools. This leads to less moral teachings from parents, faith-based teachings, and more under secular, often left-wing instruction. Meanwhile, the traditional role of the father was eroded as feminism successfully removed the legitimacy of male leadership in the home over time. The roles were reversed or at least became blurred. This brought confusion, both within families and in broader gender dynamics. A culture that once revered fatherhood and motherhood began to treat both with skepticism and remove their defining factors, claiming, there's not much discrepancy. Marriage rates declined steadily from the 1970s onward, so did birth rates. Western countries are now facing demographic collapse, as previously stated, while mass immigration is replacing their native population. This isn't just about numbers as well, it's about purpose. For centuries, marriage, family, and faith gave life direction. But as feminist ideals reshaped society, many found themselves isolated, uncertain, and searching for meaning. Promises of liberation often led not to fulfillment, but to fragmentation. And in this generation, we are seeing now for the first time in all of history, these big boss girl women in their 40s, late 30s, 50s, lonely and depressed because they've got no husband, no family with no hope of changing that, having a barren womb, and are realizing what they prioritized in life, their career, does not and cannot give them the purpose that raising kids, grandkids, and having a family does as a woman. And frankly, it's actually really sad and unfortunate. This isn't about blaming all women. Many women simply followed the path society and the media promised and praised. But the result was a cultural shift with enormous costs. Weaker families, rising loneliness, and a generation uncertain about its identity and responsibilities. What feminism claimed to liberate women from, the home, the family, traditional roles, may actually have been the very structures most vital to individual well-beings and social stability of women. The so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s was hailed as a triumph of personal liberty. Feminist theorists and cultural influencers pushed the idea that for a woman to be truly free, she must also be sexually unbound, unburdened by shame, tradition, or the expectations of chastity and modesty. Yet decades on, the consequences of this shift have not been liberation, but mass destruction. Before the sexual revolution, sexuality was largely tied to family, fidelity, and the future, specifically the bearing and raising of children within a stable marriage. But with the advent of mass contraception and the changing moral norms, sex was decoupled from commitment. Promiscuity was normalized, even, glamorized, and with it came an explosion in sexually transmitted infections, STDs, STIs, out-of-wedlock births, and the unaliving of babies through abortions. And as previously stated, part of this sexual revolution was lots of children growing up in broken homes, leading to increased rates of poverty, crime, depression, and educational disadvantages. And these are not just abstract things. These are real wounded families. And because of the social changes pushed largely, by women, it's the people behind it who funded it and backed it really, but on the front lines pushed by women, it is unfortunately women and children who are the ones suffering from these social changes the most, ironically. The popular slogan, "My body, my choice," came to symbolize a woman's right to autonomy, apparently. But stripped of its context, this phrase has also come to mean rejecting any higher moral framework. Under the banner of personal freedom and, in reality, selfishness, we are now in a culture where we can unalive babies legally for the first time in 1600 years since that's been legal. And the crazy thing is that it's supported en masse by, weak men and liberal women, and even some conservative women. People used to understand their body is not just a vessel for their own pleasure or their own function, and that life is greater and bigger than just themselves. Womanhood is not a random biological occurrence. When culture redefines that design according to trends and ideologies, the result is not freedom. It's disorientation and chaos, and we are seeing that chaos everywhere. The rise of pornography, now just a click away, is another symptom of this sexual freedom. Feminist thought, especially in its third wave and postmodern iterations, emphasized the deconstruction of modesty as a form of empowerment. In practice, this opened the floodgates to cultural pornification, music videos, advertising, social media influences, and television programming increasingly reduce the female form to a commodity or an object for unrighteous, ungodly men to look at and to goon over, rather than protecting the dignity and honor of what women are created for. This shift has led to women being more degraded than at any point in history. When everything in the culture becomes sexualized, from marketing to school curriculums, the boundaries that once were in place to protect innocence, marriage, and identity are now dismantled. Even the language has changed. The normalization of vulgar speech, especially among females and public figures, is now celebrated as bold and empowering. But is it really? From viral TikToks to primetime comedies, aggressive, profane, and often combative female personas are increasingly held up as modern role models. The once common virtues for women of gentleness, grace, and being reserved are now framed as weak or inadequate. Feminism promised empowerment, but in disregarding modesty, reverence, and the traditional idea of womanhood, it created a vacuum. In its place, offered defiancy, not dignity. It asked women to trade in humility and virtue for selfish influence and applause. But as time has gone on, that applause has proved unfulfilling for most women. Envy replaced gratitude, rebellion replaced responsibility, and the beauty of distinct male and female roles designed to complement, not compete, was cast aside for a vision of sameness that ignored the richness of difference. But no ideology can override human nature forever. The cracks are more than showing, the problems are extreme. Many women, especially younger ones, report confusion about their roles, dissatisfaction in modern dating, and disillusionment with career-first narratives. Like, I've literally seen this with people that I know who aren't even, maybe right-wing politically. They were just kind of center. That a lot of women, dissatisfied young women in Gen Z with this way of life. They sense something is off, that in casting off the old rules, we may have cast off a lot of wisdom. There is still time to recover what has been lost though. Reverence for life, honor in motherhood, joy in homemaking, and moral clarity that cherishes women not for how loud they are or for, them having heaps of opinions, but actually for how deeply they nurture and love a family. Feminism claimed it would liberate women from economic dependence. And in some respects, it actually did. Women now lead businesses, sit on boards, etc. But what is rarely acknowledged is the hidden cost of this shift in well-being. When millions of women entered the workforce en masse in the 1970s and 80s, it created a dramatic shift in household economics. Politicians and economists celebrated the rise of two-income households, but soon prices adjusted, rents rose, and housing costs ballooned. Consumer expectations expanded, and what used to be optional, both parents working, quickly became close to mandatory. This is known as the two-income trap. What once could be maintained on a single income, modest housing, schooling, food, etc., is now required for both partners to pretty much be working full-time, often with debt to cover. Dual-income households became the norm, not because of choice, but because of necessity. The system evolved to expect and, unfortunately, depend on it. And women bore the brunt of that transformation. The women that still wanted a family now had to juggle work full-time most of the time, raising kids, childcare, homemaking, etc., and has left many, many women drained. Far from being liberated, many women found themselves simply overextended. They were told they could have it all, but were given no roadmap for the cost, emotionally, relationally, or even spiritually. We now face the results. Rates of anxiety and depression among women have surged in the past 4 decades. According to numerous studies from the UK, US, and Australia, women, especially younger and middle-aged, are now more likely than men to be prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. This is not a small trend. It's a crisis of meaning. The careers women were told would fulfill them often haven't. Surveys consistently show that women reported lower life satisfaction than they did in previous generations, despite increased opportunities. Burnout is really common, as previously mentioned, and the corporate world, once seen as the arena of self-actualization, is now being reassessed by many as a place of endless striving and emotional depletion for a lot of women. Meanwhile, the skills that once defined the home, cooking, nutrition, hospitality, child rearing, herbal medicine, and intergenerational care, have been declining rapidly. Generational knowledge, once passed on from mother to daughter, grandmother to daughter, has been completely outsourced, to things like YouTube videos, schooling systems, or even just forgotten altogether. The narrative that careerism is inherently superior to homemaking, that a woman's worth is tied to her productivity or salary, has robbed generations of women in the joy and peace that the domestic sphere offers, and it has ruined the mental state and mental health of women en masse. It's time to ask the question, what is truly liberating? Is it endless economic striving, or is it recovering the way of life where women are celebrated for their virtue, not vanity, their nurturing, not their net worth? Women are not meant to be machines, they are nurturers. And if we are to rebuild the West, it will not be through GDP, board meetings, or women in board meetings, or even things like mass immigration and stuff like that. But it'll be through restored homes, revived marriages, and true strong families. And if you're enjoying this video so far, hit a like to help me out. And as feminism advanced its cause in the public sphere, it didn't merely elevate women. It often did so by tearing down men. From the early days of second wave feminism, one of the dominant refrains was that men were the source of women's oppression, apparently. Patriarchy, once understood as a model of male responsibility and sacrificial leadership within family and faith, was redefined as a system of domination. Masculine authority, instead of being seen as protective and life-giving, was painted as inherently evil, abusive, or obsolete. This framing profoundly reshaped public discourse. Popular media, educational institutions, and even government messaging began promoting the idea that male leadership was not just outdated, but apparently dangerous. The strong male leader archetype, once respected in both the home and communities, was gradually replaced with a new label, toxic masculinity. The concept of toxic masculinity was pushed under the guise of calling out abusive behavior, but in reality, it was a blanket term used to critique nearly any form of traditional manhood: stoicism, assertiveness, physical strength, or even leadership. The result was not a healthier masculinity, but a confused, weak, and passive one. Men began retreating, some in an attempt to be sensitive or respectful, became afraid to lead. Others, disillusioned by the hostility they faced in relationships, the legal system, no-fault divorce laws, etc., or media portrayals, some of them just disengaged entirely because of these things. Marriage rates among men have plummeted, and fatherlessness continues to rise, even not always by choice, but often by this horrible cultural design that we now live in. It's not just that men were pushed aside. The institutions that shape strong men, the military, the family, were also systemically undermined. And at the exact same time, a new ideology began to take root, one that denied even the reality of sex-based differences. Feminism had long argued that gender was a social construct. This laid the intellectual groundwork for today's gender theory, which asserts that being male or female is a matter of identity, not biology. While many early feminists, rejected this shift, the movement's own logic, detaching gender from function and design, opened the door for it. The rise of transgender ideology, which now affects school curriculums, legal policies, and public discourse, did not happen on its own. It was built upon decades of deconstruction, first of the roles, then of nature, and finally of reality itself. When the manhood role of servant leadership, courage, and sacrifice are mocked or dismantled, it is not just men who suffer. It's everyone. Boys grow up with no role models, girls grow up with no protection, and the primary unit of civilization is left rudderless. Feminism has been used as a tool to erode Western civilization. By undermining the natural order of the family, it did not just critique patriarchy. It tried to replace the natural order with the reverse or inverse. The rebuilding of masculinity must start with truth. Men here are not the problem. They are a vital part of the solution. And when women honor and support men in their traditional roles and men rise up to meet it with strength and humility, families flourish and nations prosper. The deepest wound inflicted by feminism has not been upon men or women alone, but upon the next generation. Daughters were told to be everything that their mothers were not. They were raised to view femininity as weakness, motherhood as a trap, and submission as oppressive. From a young age, girls were taught to aspire to male-coded forms of power, career, status, conquest, while rejecting the beauty of softness, nurturing, and legacy. Feminine virtues such as modesty, gentleness, and patience, once considered strength, were recast as liabilities. Instead, assertiveness, independence, and self-expression became the new virtues, regardless of how disconnected from design or purpose they were. Many young women now reach adulthood unsure of how to care for a home, support a husband, or raise children. Not because they lack the capacity, but because they were never shown how, or worse, were actively discouraged from doing so. At the same time, some boys were raised without fathers, or others, at least mostly, without true masculine fathers. The school system, increasingly feminized in both structure and philosophy, with the rise of many female high school teachers as well, had a part to play in that, tends to reward compliance, emotional restraint, and verbal fluency over physical energy, risk-taking, and leadership. Boys who once would have been directed towards productive outlets like apprenticeships, agriculture, or trade are now medicated for restlessness and blamed for maybe possible toxic traits. The result is a generation of disorientated young men, underachieving, undermotivated, and unprepared to lead. The call to traditional manhood and womanhood is not about controlling people. It's about setting them free and actually pushing them to flourish, or letting them flourish as they were made and intended to. A daughter raised to honor her femininity will not grow bitter. She will grow beautiful inside and out, and a son raised to embrace his masculine responsibility will not grow violent. He will grow virtuous and have strength under control. In a world increasingly defined by fluid identities and role confusion, the traditional model of gender stands out as ancient and has proven the test of time. When the family breaks down, the nation follows. This truth, so old it once went unquestioned, has been forgotten in modern discourse, but the consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. A weakened home produces a weakened people, and when the foundational unit of society is fractured, the entire structure of the nation begins to wobble. As families have declined, the state has expanded. What once was managed at the kitchen table or living room, discipline, education, identity, and values, is now regulated through government agencies, public schools, and bureaucratic programs. But feminism didn't stop at domestic life. Its ideological spread affected how nations view identity, order, and even sovereignty itself. Feminism told Western women to compete rather than to nurture, to delay or forgo children, and to reject the faith and traditionalism that shaped their own civilization for, once again, the last 1600 years. The result is that Western nations are importing foreign populations who they hold to their own traditions and values, and at the same time we are completely disregarding and throwing out our own. Globalism, the idea that borders, identities, and national loyalties should dissolve in favor of a one world order, found a very useful ally in feminism. Or arguably, I guess they created it for that reason. By weakening the family, blurring gender distinctions, and undermining faith institutions, the feminist movement helped create a population more easily molded by mass media, centralized government, and transnational corporate interests. Western men, meanwhile, have been systematically demonized and demoralized. They are told to be passive, weak, and emotionally neutered. They are rarely honored for their bravery, their provision of their leadership, and in contrast, women are told to lead, to dominate, and to correct, often without the balance or any sense of traditionalism of respect or interdependence. And this inversion of order is not accidental. It mirrors the ideological goal of breaking down all traditional hierarchies such as family, gender, nation, and God. If the West is to survive, not just politically or economically, but spiritually and culturally, it must recover the family, The great lie of liberation told us that tradition was bondage, that family was oppression, and that gender was a social construct. It offered autonomy and actually gave anxiety. It promised empowerment and actually left most women exhausted. It said women could have it all and left them with less of everything that matters. The consequences are all around us. Broken homes, declining birth rates, fragmented identities, and a rising generation that is more lost, more medicated, and more uncertain than any in history. But this collapse is not inevitable, and it is not final. We need a political and social revolution and a spiritual return. A return to traditionalism, strong men who lead families and societies with honor and respect, and feminine women who love and nurture, raising children and backing the men to lead with courage. Feminism tells us men and women need to be free from one another, but the truth is, we were made for each other, to complement each other, and to create happy, healthy families and societies. It's not too late to turn around, to rebuild what's been broken, to revive what's been lost, and to restore what was once strong, noble, and good. If we want our daughters to thrive, our sons to lead, and our nations to stand, we must return.